The air in New Orleans was thick with humidity and mystery. As the car turned onto Bourbon Street, Sam Burke, head of the government's elite paranormal investigation team, looked up at the looming silhouette of the Bourbon Orleans Hotel. Once a beacon of elegance, the hotel's crumbling facade now seemed like a haunted relic of its former glory. Its ornate balconies and weathered shutters whispered of dark secrets and lost souls. The team had been called here by a private tip from a high-ranking government official. People had been disappearing, tourists, staff, even a few locals. And worse, those who survived spoke of terrifying creatures roaming the halls at night. Crawlers, shadowmen, skinwalkers. Sam's gut twisted as he recalled the dossier filled with grisly images of mangled bodies, claw marks, and disfigured faces. He had seen a lot in his line of work, but something about this case felt different. As they pulled up to the entrance, Sam glanced over at his team. Harrison, their fearless leader, looked grim. Maya, the team's psychic medium, was already deep in concentration, her eyes darting as if she could already sense the spirits inside. Then there was Chris, the tech expert, who was unusually quiet, fiddling nervously with his ghost-hunting gear. "Let's get this over with," Harrison muttered, stepping out of the car. The team followed him inside, greeted by the eerie silence of the lobby. The hotel's charm had long faded, leaving only an oppressive atmosphere that clung to them like a wet blanket. The night manager, a nervous-looking man with sweat beading on his forehead, met them at the front desk. His voice trembled as he spoke. You're the team, right? Thank God you're here. Things have been strange. People disappearing, guests screaming in the middle of the night, and the shadows, they move when they shouldn't." Sam exchanged a glance with Maya, who looked even more uneasy. "Can you show us the rooms where the guests went missing?" The manager hesitated before nodding. "Of course, but be careful. Something's not right in this hotel." As they made their way up the grand staircase, the floorboards creaked beneath their feet, and the air grew colder. Maya stopped suddenly, her hand gripping the railing. "They're here," she whispered, her breath fogging in the chill. "They've been waiting for us." Sam's heart raced. Whatever was haunting the Bourbon Orleans wasn't just a simple spirit. Something much darker was lurking in the shadows. They reached the third floor, where the first guest had disappeared. The hallway was dimly lit, the flickering lights casting eerie shadows along the walls. The door to room 312 stood slightly ajar, as if inviting them in. Sam signaled for Chris to set up the equipment. He placed motion sensors along the hall, while Maya moved closer to the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the knob. "I can feel it," she muttered, her voice barely audible. "Something's in there waiting." Harrison pushed open the door. Inside, the room was in disarray. Furniture overturned, sheets torn, and deep claw marks gouged into the walls. It looked like a battlefield, but there was no sign of a struggle, no blood, nothing to indicate where the guest had gone. "Jesus," Harrison breathed, running a hand through his hair. Whatever happened here, it wasn't human. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. The hairs on the back of Sam's neck stood up as a soft scratching noise echoed from the closet. Chris immediately pointed his infrared camera toward the source of the sound, the screen flickering with strange, distorted figures. Maya stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she stared at the closet door. "It's not just one, there are many." Her voice was distant, as if she were channeling something from another realm. "They're trapped, bound to this place by something ancient, something evil." Before anyone could react, the closet door burst open with a deafening crash, and a shadow shot out from the darkness, darting across the room like a black blur. Sam barely had time to raise his flashlight before it vanished, leaving behind only a cold, lingering presence. Chris's equipment began to beep wildly, detecting movement all around them. The air grew thick with tension as the shadows on the walls began to twist and shift, forming grotesque shapes, creatures with elongated limbs and hollow eyes. Harrison grabbed his walkie. "We need backup now," he shouted into the device, but all he got in return was static. Suddenly, the shadows lunged at them, clawing at the air. Maya screamed as one of the figures wrapped its icy fingers around her wrist, dragging her toward the bed. Sam and Harrison rushed to her side, pulling her free just as the shadow dissolved into the wall. Panting, Maya looked up, her face pale. "They're getting stronger. We have to leave. Now. But as they turned toward the door, it slammed shut with a violent force. They were trapped, and the shadows were closing in. The door slammed with a finality that sent a chill down Sam's spine. The shadows danced across the walls, growing more twisted and menacing with every passing second. It felt like the entire room was alive with dark energy, and every breath they took seemed to draw them closer to whatever malevolent force lurked within the hotel. "Chris, get that door open now," Harrison barked, his voice laced with urgency. Chris rushed to the door, yanking on the handle with all his might, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if something invisible was holding it shut. "It's stuck," he grunted, sweat beading on his forehead. "It's like there's something on the other side." Sam moved closer to the center of the room, where Maya was still on the floor, trembling from her encounter with the shadow. Her eyes were wide, darting around the room as if she could see things the others couldn't. "They're everywhere," she whispered, her voice shaky. "They're watching us." Harrison knelt beside her, his face grim. "Maya, can you tell what they want?" Maya's breath hitched as she shook her head. "No, it's not that simple. These things, they're not just spirits. They're something older, darker, bound to this place by a curse." "A curse," Sam repeated, his stomach twisting. He had dealt with cursed objects before, but a cursed building? This was something new, and far more dangerous. As if in response to her words, the shadows surged forward, crawling along the floor like living smoke. They wrapped around the legs of the overturned furniture, creeping closer to the team. Chris fumbled with his gear, trying to activate the EMF detector, but the equipment was malfunctioning, the screen flickering erratically. "Forget the tech," Harrison growled, grabbing his flashlight and aiming it toward the closet. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing more claw marks etched into the walls, deep, jagged gouges that looked like they had been made by something with immense strength. Then, from the far corner of the room, a low growl echoed, a guttural, animalistic sound that made Sam's blood run cold. "What the hell was that?" Chris whispered, his face pale. Before anyone could answer, the growl turned into a roar. A shadowman, its form massive and grotesque, emerged from the wall, its hollow eyes fixed on the team. It was like nothing they had ever seen before, an abomination of twisted limbs and black smoke, its body contorting unnaturally as it moved. "Move," Harrison shouted, pushing Maya out of the way just as the creature lunged toward them. Sam barely had time to react before the thing swiped at him, its claws slicing through the air where he had been standing moments before. Chris grabbed a chair and swung it at the creature, but it passed right through its smoky form. "It's not solid," he yelled, backing away. The shadowman let out a deafening screech, its body expanding, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. Sam's heart pounded in his chest as the temperature dropped even further, his breath coming out in visible puffs of air. "We need to get out of here," Sam said, his voice tight with fear. "Now," Harrison nodded, grabbing Maya by the arm and pulling her to her feet. Chris frantically tried the door again, but it remained sealed shut. Then, without warning, the creature lunged again, this time at Chris. Its shadowy form engulfed him, and for a horrifying moment, Sam thought it was going to devour him whole. But then, just as quickly as it had attacked, the shadowman vanished, leaving Chris gasping for breath on the floor. "They're playing with us," Maya whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's just the beginning." After what felt like hours trapped in the room, the door finally creaked open on its own, as if whatever force had been holding it shut had decided to let them go. Sam didn't hesitate. He grabbed Maya's arm and pulled her through the door, with Harrison and Chris following close behind. The hallway was eerily silent. The flickering lights had gone out completely, leaving the team in near total darkness. "This place feels wrong," Harrison muttered, glancing around. "We need to regroup, figure out what we're dealing with." As they made their way down the corridor, they noticed something strange. The walls seemed to be shifting, the doors changing position. It was as if the hotel itself was alive, its layout constantly rearranging. Chris stopped in his tracks, staring at a door that wasn't supposed to be there. "Wait, that room wasn't here before." Sam frowned, moving closer to the door. It was an old wooden door, different from the rest of the modernized hotel. The number 616 was etched into the wood, but there was something off about it. "I don't like this," Maya whispered, clutching Sam's arm. "I've heard stories about this place. There's a room that doesn't exist, one that only appears to those who are marked." "Marked?" Harrison asked, raising an eyebrow. Maya nodded, her face pale. "Once you enter, you don't come out." Sam exchanged a glance with Harrison. "What do you think? Do we check it out?" Harrison hesitated, then nodded. "We don't have much choice, but be ready for anything." With a deep breath, Sam turned the handle, and the door swung open with a low creak. Inside, the air was freezing, and the shadows seemed to pulse with life. They stepped into the room cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The room was empty, save for a single blood-stained bed in the center. But the moment they crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind them. The temperature plummeted further, and the shadows began to swirl around them like a black fog. The air was thick with malevolence, and a feeling of pure evil hung in the air. "We need to get out," Chris said, his voice shaky. But as they turned to leave, the walls began to close in, and the shadows erupted, dragging them deeper into the nightmare of the Bourbon Orleans. The darkness in room 616 felt alive, pressing against them like a suffocating blanket. Sam's heart raced, his breath shallow as he turned his flashlight toward the far corner of the room. The shadows there seemed thicker, moving in slow, deliberate patterns as if watching their every move. "What the hell is that?" Chris whispered, backing away from the wall. The wallpaper peeled off in long, jagged strips, revealing deep gouges etched into the wood beneath. Claw marks, inhuman and violent. The walls were scarred from floor to ceiling, as though something had been trying to escape. Or perhaps, something had been trying to get in. Maya, still pale and trembling, stood close to Sam, her eyes wide with terror. "I've heard about this room," she murmured. "The cursed room. It traps people, drives them mad until they disappear." Harrison moved cautiously to the bed in the center of the room, his face hard with determination. "Whatever's here, it's been feeding on people's fear for decades. We're not going to give it the satisfaction." Suddenly, the walls began to creak, a low groaning sound that echoed throughout the room. The shadows in the corner started to stretch, elongating into grotesque figures. They moved slowly, creeping along the walls like black serpents, their forms twisting and writhing. "We need to get out," Sam said urgently. He grabbed Maya's arm and moved toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was sealed shut once again, as if the room itself had decided to keep them inside. Harrison's eyes narrowed. "Don't panic. This thing wants us to break. That's how it wins." But as the shadows closed in, panic was already setting in. Chris was muttering under his breath, his fingers fumbling with the EMF detector. "It's spiking. Something's here, something big." Suddenly, from the far corner of the room, a figure emerged, a shadowman. Its body was elongated, its arms too long, its fingers tapering into sharp, bony claws. Its face was a dark, hollow void, eyes like pits of endless blackness. The creature let out a low growl, the sound vibrating through the floor. It moved toward them with unnatural speed, its body contorting grotesquely as it approached. Sam's pulse quickened as the shadowman towered over them, its presence radiating pure malevolence. "Stay back," Harrison barked, raising his flashlight and aiming it directly at the creature. But the light did nothing. The shadowman passed through the beam effortlessly, as if it were nothing more than a mist. Before anyone could react, the creature lunged at Chris, its claws digging into his arm. He let out a scream as the shadowman began to drag him toward the far wall, the air around him warping with dark energy. "No!" Sam shouted, rushing forward. He grabbed Chris by the other arm, pulling with all his strength, but the shadowman was stronger, its grip tightening. Harrison, thinking quickly, grabbed a salt canister from his bag and flung its contents toward the creature. The salt hit the shadowman like acid, and it let out a shrill, inhuman scream, releasing its grip on Chris and retreating into the darkness. "Salt!" Harrison breathed. "It hates salt." Chris collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, his arm bleeding from the deep claw marks. "That thing, it was trying to take me into the wall." Maya knelt beside Chris, inspecting his wounds. We need to get him out of here. Now. Harrison nodded, but the door remained sealed, the shadows still swirling around them like predators waiting for the right moment to strike. Sam's mind raced, searching for a way out, but the room seemed to shift and distort with every second. Then, from the far wall, a low voice echoed, whispering, calling to them. "Join us!" The voice was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder with each passing second. A cold, unnatural whisper that seemed to seep into their minds, beckoning them deeper into the hotel. "Do you hear that?" Maya's voice was shaky, her eyes darting around the room. Sam nodded, his throat dry. "It's coming from the walls." Chris, still pale and shaking from his encounter with the shadowman, stood unsteadily, clutching his wounded arm. "We need to leave. Now." But the door remained shut, and the shadows continued to swirl. It was as if the room itself was alive, trapping them in a nightmare from which there was no escape. Harrison took a deep breath, his face set with grim determination. "We're not staying here any longer." He reached into his bag and pulled out a small device, a ghost hunting tool designed to break through paranormal interference. With a sharp click, he activated it, and a low hum filled the room. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. Without hesitation, they bolted into the hallway, the oppressive air of room 616 falling away behind them. The hallway was eerily quiet, the flickering lights casting long, unnatural shadows on the walls. But something was off. The hall seemed different. "This wasn't how we came in," Sam said, his voice low. Maya's eyes were wide with fear. "The hotel is changing." They moved quickly, navigating the twisted corridors, but no matter which direction they turned, they found themselves back in the same spot. The layout of the hotel had shifted, trapping them in a looping maze of dark hallways. "This isn't right," Harrison muttered, glancing around. "The hotel's messing with us." As they turned a corner, the air suddenly grew thick with a foul stench. The walls seemed to pulse, and from the shadows, figures began to emerge, dozens of them. Crawlers, inhuman, twisted creatures that skittered across the floor and walls, their glowing red eyes fixed on the team. "They're coming," Chris whispered, his voice trembling. The crawlers moved with terrifying speed, their bony limbs scraping against the walls as they closed in. Harrison pulled a handful of salt from his bag, throwing it toward the nearest creatures. The salt hit them like acid, causing the crawlers to screech and recoil. But more were coming, too many to fend off. "We need to move," Sam shouted, grabbing Maya's arm as they ran down the hall. But the crawlers were relentless, their numbers growing with every second. As they rounded another corner, the hallway opened up into a vast, dilapidated ballroom, its once grand chandelier now hanging precariously from the ceiling. The room was filled with shadows, and in the center stood a tall, thin figure. A shadowman. It stood perfectly still, its hollow eyes watching them, waiting. "This is it," Harrison said, his voice tense. "Whatever's controlling this place, it's here." The ballroom's decayed grandeur was unsettling, its rotting velvet curtains swaying gently in the breeze that shouldn't have existed indoors. The air felt heavier, thick with anticipation, and the oppressive energy that filled the room seemed to pull at their very souls. The shadowman stood in the center, an embodiment of pure malevolence, its hollow eyes locked on the team. Sam felt a chill crawl up his spine as the creature began to move, its body flowing like liquid darkness. "Don't look into its eyes," Harrison warned, his voice steady but tense. "It'll get inside your head." Maya clutched the ghost hunting gear tightly, her knuckles white. "What do we do? We can't fight something like that." "Not directly," Harrison replied, pulling a silver knife from his belt, an artifact they had recovered during a previous mission. "But we don't need to. We just need to trap it." The shadowman glided toward them, its form shifting and distorting as it moved. The darkness seemed to thicken around it, like a fog swallowing everything in its path. Sam could hear whispers, faint, seductive voices urging him to give in, to surrender to the void. "Sam, focus." Harrison snapped, shaking him out of his trance. Sam blinked, his mind clearing just in time to see the shadowman extend a long, twisted arm toward them. Harrison threw a line of salt across the floor, creating a barrier between them and the entity. The creature hissed in response, recoiling slightly, but it wasn't enough to stop it. "We're going to need more than salt," Chris said, his voice shaky as he scanned the room for any sign of an exit. But the ballroom, like the rest of the hotel, had shifted. There were no doors, no windows, only the suffocating darkness and the growing presence of the shadowman. Suddenly, the floor beneath them trembled. The chandelier above swayed ominously, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. And from those shadows, more figures began to emerge, crawlers, their grotesque forms skittering along the walls and ceiling, their glowing red eyes fixated on the team. "They're surrounding us," Maya whispered, her voice barely audible. The shadowman let out a low, rumbling growl as it began to circle them, its movements slow and deliberate. Harrison's grip tightened on the knife. "We need to push it back. Get it into the center of the room." As if sensing their plan, the shadowman lunged toward Chris, its arms stretching unnaturally long. Chris dove to the side just in time, but the creature's touch grazed his leg, leaving behind a burning, icy sensation. He gasped in pain as the crawlers began to close in from all sides. "We can't fight them all," Maya shouted, her voice rising in panic. Harrison glanced at her, then back at the shadowman. "We don't have to. We just need to make sure we don't give it what it wants." "And what's that?" Sam asked, his heart pounding in his chest. Harrison's expression darkened. "Us." The crawlers surged forward, their skeletal limbs clattering against the floor as they swarmed toward the group. Harrison threw another line of salt, but this time it barely slowed them down. The shadowman, now fully formed, towered over them, its presence overwhelming. Maya's breath hitched as the room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in, the darkness suffocating. "We have to get out of here." But there was no escape. The ballroom had become a trap, and the shadowman was the key. Sam's mind raced, searching for something, anything, that could give them an edge. And then he saw it, a faint shimmer of light at the far end of the room, a crack in the darkness. "There!" Sam shouted, pointing toward the light. "It's a way out." The crack of light at the far end of the ballroom glimmered like a beacon in the oppressive darkness. Sam's shout snapped everyone into action, their collective desperation flaring into a sudden burst of energy. But the shadowman was already aware, its hollow eyes narrowing as it shifted its position to block their path. Harrison didn't hesitate. "Get to the light. I'll hold it off." Maya grabbed Sam's arm, pulling him along as they darted toward the faint hope of escape. Chris limped behind them, clutching his leg where the shadowman had touched him, the skin there already turning a sickly shade of black. The crawlers screeched as they surged forward, their grotesque bodies scraping against the crumbling walls. Harrison stepped in front of the shadowman, brandishing the silver knife with grim determination. "You're not taking any of us." The shadowman responded with a deep, guttural sound, a laugh, low and cruel, that echoed throughout the ballroom. The temperature dropped even further, and frost began to form on the windows, the air thick with an unnatural cold. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment. Harrison lunged, slashing at the creature with the knife. The blade passed through the shadowman's form, causing it to momentarily ripple, but it quickly reformed, more solid than ever. The creature's arm shot out, slamming into Harrison's chest and sending him flying across the room. "Harrison!" Maya screamed, but there was no time to check if he was okay. The light ahead grew brighter, but the air around them seemed to thicken with each step, as if the hotel itself was trying to stop them from leaving. Sam's legs felt heavy, like wading through deep mud, and the whispers in his head grew louder, more insistent. "Come back, join us." He shook his head, trying to focus. They had to keep moving. He wouldn't let the hotel win, not after everything they'd been through. Chris stumbled, his injured leg giving out, and Maya quickly crouched beside him. "We're almost there. You can make it." But the crawlers were closing in. Sam could feel them, dozens of them, moving faster, their screeching intensifying. He turned to see the creatures skittering along the walls and ceiling, their eyes glowing with hunger. The shadowman, now standing over Harrison's fallen body, seemed to stretch and contort, its dark form towering like a nightmare. "We're not going to make it," Chris muttered through gritted teeth. "Yes, we are," Sam said, more to himself than anyone else. "We have to." They pushed forward, the crack of light growing closer with each step. But just as they were about to reach it, the light flickered, then vanished, plunging them into complete darkness. Maya gasped, her hand gripping Sam's arm tightly. No, it was right there. The hotel's malevolent energy surged, the air turning icy cold. The walls groaned as if alive, shifting and warping around them. The ballroom had become a void, an endless expanse of shadow. And from the center of that void, the shadowman's voice echoed, low, mocking, and filled with malice. "You're mine now." The void swallowed them whole, leaving only darkness and the oppressive weight of dread. Sam could feel the ground beneath his feet, but it didn't feel solid, more like standing on the edge of something unfathomable, as if the floor could give way at any moment, plunging them into the depths of the abyss. Maya's grip on his arm tightened. "Sam, where are we?" Her voice was barely a whisper, the fear creeping in like a cold wind. "I don't know," he replied, though the truth gnawed at him. They weren't in the ballroom anymore, or even the hotel. This was something else, somewhere else. In the distance, the faintest glow appeared, a sickly green hue that pulsed like a dying heartbeat. The air was heavy with whispers, indistinct voices swirling around them, too low to understand but loud enough to unsettle. Chris groaned in pain, still clutching his leg. "We need to move. Whatever that thing is, it's not done with us." The Shadowman's voice echoed through the void, slithering into their minds. "You cannot escape. You belong to me now." The words wrapped around their thoughts like tendrils, squeezing tighter with every second. Sam clenched his fists, trying to shut out the voice. "We have to keep going. That light, it might be our way out." The group moved toward the pulsating glow, each step feeling like an eternity. The air thickened with every breath, and the ground beneath them shifted, cracking and splintering. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if the darkness itself was trying to pull them back. As they neared the light, the shadows began to move. At first, it was subtle, small shapes shifting at the edges of their vision. But soon, the shapes took form, crawling and writhing toward them. The crawlers were back, their grotesque bodies twisting and contorting, eyes glowing with malice. Maya gasped, pulling Sam to a stop. Look! Ahead, at the heart of the green glow, was the Shadowman, its form towering and more solid than ever. But it wasn't alone. Figures stood at its side, twisted, decaying shapes that once might have been human. They were pale, gaunt, their eyes hollow and their mouths twisted into grotesque smiles. "Victims," Chris muttered. "Those are the people who disappeared here." The realization hit them all at once. The Shadowman had been collecting them, trapping their souls in this twisted place. And now they were next. "We need to do something," Sam said, his voice shaking. "We can't let it take us." Harrison, still weak but conscious, staggered to his feet. "The salt, the knife, we need to bind it, or we're done for." But the Shadowman was already moving, its eyes fixed on them, as the dead figures began to advance, their broken bodies moving with unnatural speed. The crawlers skittered closer, their screeches filling the void. "Get ready," Harrison growled, raising the silver knife once more. The light flickered and pulsed, casting eerie shadows on the twisted figures advancing toward them. The air crackled with tension, as if the very atmosphere was alive with the malevolent energy of the Shadowman. Sam could feel it pressing down on them, heavy and suffocating, like the weight of an invisible hand closing around their throats. The first of the dead lunged forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, its hollow eyes fixed on Sam. He barely had time to react before Harrison stepped in, slashing with the silver knife. The blade cut through the figure like butter, its decayed form dissolving into ash before it hit the ground. "There's too many of them," Maya cried out, backing away as more of the dead advanced. "Keep moving," Harrison shouted, his voice rough and strained. "We can't let them corner us." The group moved as one, dodging and weaving through the oncoming horde, their steps frantic and desperate. But no matter how fast they ran, the crawlers were always just a step behind, their glowing red eyes cutting through the darkness like knives. The Shadowman watched from the center of the light, its form growing more solid with every second, feeding off the fear that hung in the air. Sam could feel its eyes on him, cold and unyielding, as if it was waiting for the right moment to strike. "We need to trap it," Sam said through gritted teeth, his heart pounding in his chest. "If we don't, it's going to tear us apart." Harrison nodded, his grip tightening on the knife. "Salt circle. Now." They moved quickly, laying down lines of salt in a wide circle around the shadowman, using the last of their supplies. The shadowman hissed, recoiling slightly as it realized what they were doing, but it wasn't enough to stop it. "It's not working," Maya screamed as the shadowman surged forward, its form twisting and writhing, growing larger and more monstrous with every step. Sam's mind raced, searching for a solution. They were out of options, out of time. But then something clicked. The light, the pulsating glow at the center of the void. It wasn't just the shadowman's source of power. It was the key. "Hit the light," Sam shouted, his voice barely audible over the sound of the crawlers closing in. Harrison hesitated for a split second, then nodded. He raised the knife, aiming for the center of the light. With a swift, powerful throw, the blade sailed through the air, piercing the glowing orb. For a moment, everything went still. The shadowman froze, its body flickering, as if unsure of its own form. The crawlers stopped in their tracks, their eyes dimming, their movements slowing. And then, with a deafening roar, the light exploded. The shockwave rippled through the void, shattering the darkness and sending the shadowman and its minions screaming into the abyss. The dead figures disintegrated, their souls finally freed from the shadowman's grasp. The group collapsed to the ground, panting and shaking, as the void began to dissolve around them. The ballroom reappeared, the familiar, decayed walls now eerily quiet. They had won, but the price had been high. As they staggered to their feet, Harrison wiped the blood from his face, his expression grim. "Let's get out of here," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Sam looked around at the now empty ballroom, the shadows still lingering at the edges of his vision. The hotel wasn't done with them yet, and somewhere in the darkness, the shadow man waited for its next victims.